The first thing that made people stop scrolling wasn't a headline. It wasn't a quote. It was the silence. Because when news quietly surfaced that Prince Harry was preparing to return to the United Kingdom without his wife, there was no joint statement, no carefully crafted reassurance, no familiar line about being stronger than ever. Just absence. And sometimes, absence says more than any announcement ever could. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the shocking question no one wanted to ask out loud. How does a couple who once insisted they were inseparable suddenly end up on opposite sides of an ocean? Think about it. This was the marriage that rewrote royal rules. The couple who left together, fought together, and presented themselves as a united front against the world. For years, every move was framed as we decided. We stepped back. We're building a new life. So when reports emerged that Harry was going back to the UK alone, people didn't just raise their eyebrows. They froze. Because that wasn't a trip. That was a direction. And then came the second blow. Meghan Markle wasn't going. Not now. Not later. Not once things settle. She was staying put. Firmly. Deliberately. And according to those following the situation closely, this wasn't hesitation. It was refusal. Ask yourself this. When one partner moves toward their past, and the other digs deeper into the present, what does that usually mean? The timing makes this impossible to ignore. This isn't happening in a vacuum. Not after months of strained appearances, carefully separated projects, and a noticeable shift in how they're discussed publicly. Harry talking about legacy, roots, and responsibility. Meghan focused on independence, control, and future positioning. Two narratives moving forward. But no longer in parallel. What makes this moment different is that no one rushed to clean it up. No palisade. No PR proxy. No late night. Sources say everything is fine. Instead, the story was allowed to breathe. And as it did, people began noticing the contradictions. The quiet logistical changes. The legal implications no one wanted to touch yet. The question of where decisions about children, residence, and jurisdiction are really being made. And here's where the tension sharpens. Because insiders suggest this wasn't a sudden disagreement. It was the result of a conversation that didn't end in compromise. One where going back to the UK wasn't framed as temporary, and staying behind wasn't framed as waiting. So what really happened behind closed doors? Why now? And why does this feel less like a separation and more like preparation? Because the truth is, when one person packs their bags to return to where it all began, and the other refuses to follow, the story has already crossed a line. And what Harry believed this move would fix may have triggered something Meghan had already decided. So what exactly was the moment everything shifted? Because this wasn't a dramatic fight with raised voices and slammed doors. It was quieter than that. More dangerous than that. It was a decision made in stages, wrapped in reason, presented as practical, but carrying the emotional weight of a goodbye. The first sign came when Prince Harry stopped talking about visits and started talking about returning. That single word matters more than people realize. Visiting implies temporary. Returning implies belonging, roots, permanence. And when Harry began framing the UK not as a place he had escaped from, but as a place he needed to go back to, something fundamental changed. Here's the contradiction that stunned even longtime observers. For years, Harry described Britain as emotionally suffocating, a place tied to trauma, scrutiny, and unresolved grief. So why now? Why go back to the very environment he once said he had to flee to survive? Sources close to the situation point to a convergence of pressures. Family health concerns, legal matters that can't be managed from across the Atlantic, and something far more personal, a growing sense that cutting himself off entirely from his past didn't bring the peace he expected. Instead, it left him untethered. But here's where the story takes its sharp turn. Because when Harry raised the idea of returning, it wasn't met with hesitation. It was met with resistance. Meghan Markle, according to those watching closely, didn't argue logistics. She didn't ask about timelines. She didn't negotiate terms. She drew a boundary. Clear. Firm. Final. She was not going back. Ask yourself why that matters so much. In healthy relationships, major life moves are negotiated, adjusted, reframed. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was two people realizing they wanted incompatible futures. Harry looking backward to understand himself. Meghan looking forward to protect control over her life, her image, and her autonomy. And suddenly, the we language disappeared. Short sentences replaced long explanations. Schedules stopped overlapping. Decisions were framed individually, not jointly. People close to them noticed something chilling. Neither side seemed shocked by the outcome. Almost as if this conversation had been rehearsed emotionally long before it happened in real life. Think about that for a moment. What does it mean when a marriage-ending conversation doesn't feel explosive, but inevitable? The most unsettling part isn't that Harry is returning to the UK. It's that he's doing so with an apparent acceptance that Meghan will not be there. No public pleading. No visible effort to persuade. Just a quiet forward motion, as if he understands something the public hasn't fully grasped yet. And that raises an even darker question. If this decision wasn't impulsive, if it wasn't emotional, then what triggered it? What changed behind the scenes that made both of them stop trying to pull the other along? Because when two people stop fighting for the same future, the real story isn't about distance. It's about preparation. And what Meghan may have been preparing for all along could turn this separation into something far more final than anyone expected. So if this wasn't hesitation, what exactly was Meghan doing by staying put? Here's the uncomfortable truth most headlines won't say out loud. Refusing to follow isn't always about emotion. Sometimes it's about leverage. When Meghan Markle made it clear she wasn't returning to the UK, the reaction wasn't confusion among insiders. It was recognition. Because to people who understand power dynamics, this move made sense. Painful sense. Strategic sense. Think about it. Geography isn't just location. It's jurisdiction. It's legal framework. It's control over narrative, over timing, over next steps. Staying in the United States doesn't just keep Meghan in familiar territory culturally. It anchors her in a system where she understands the media, the legal terrain, and the long game far better than she ever did across the Atlantic. And that's where the contradiction deepens. Publicly, the couple built their brand on unity, on shared grievance, on mutual escape. But privately, their priorities began to diverge. Harry, increasingly reflective, started speaking about history, reconciliation, unfinished business. Meghan, increasingly forward-facing, doubled down on independence, self-definition, and insulation from institutions she never fully trusted. Ask yourself this. When one partner starts looking inward and the other starts locking doors, who's already accepted the ending? People close to the situation noticed that Meghan's refusal wasn't reactive. It was calm, almost resolved. No dramatic ultimatums. No public heartbreak. Just a steady line drawn in the sand. This wasn't "I can't." It was "I won't." And that distinction matters. Because while Harry's return to the UK carries emotional weight, Meghan's decision to stay carries legal and strategic weight. Children's residency, custody assumptions, where future proceedings would occur if things escalated. These aren't afterthoughts. These are chess moves. Quiet ones. Now here's the twist most people miss. Harry leaving doesn't weaken Meghan's position. In some ways, it strengthens it. Remaining stateside allows her to maintain continuity. Projects continue. Networks stay intact. The narrative becomes one of stability on her side, disruption on his. Meanwhile, Prince Harry returning to the UK places him back under scrutiny, tradition, and expectations he once rejected. Familiar ground, yes, but also constrained ground. And that imbalance matters if this story shifts from emotional separation to legal reality. So was this refusal about resentment? Or was it about foresight? Because here's the chilling part. Those watching closely say Meghan didn't need time to think. She didn't ask for space. She already knew her answer, which suggests the possibility that this scenario wasn't feared, it was anticipated. And if that's true, then Harry's return may not be the beginning of reconciliation with his past. It may be the moment he unknowingly stepped into a future Meghan had already planned for. Because once location hardens into position, the next step isn't discussion. It's action. And the action Meghan may be preparing to take could make this split irreversible. So what happens when separation stops being emotional and starts becoming procedural? Because that's the moment this story quietly crossed into dangerous territory. Up until now, everything could still be framed as distance. Time apart, reflection, space to breathe. But behind the scenes, something far more concrete began to take shape. And it centered on one uncomfortable reality. Once decisions are tied to law, not feelings, there is no easy rewind. Here's the revelation that reframed everything for people paying close attention. Harry's return to the UK wasn't just about family or closure. It intersected with timing. Legal timing. The kind that forces choices before anyone feels ready to make them. Think about how rare that is. Most couples drift apart slowly, ambiguously. But this situation demanded clarity. Where's the primary residence? Which country governs future decisions? Who establishes stability? And who becomes the one who left? That's when the separation stopped feeling mutual. Because while Prince Harry was stepping back into an old world he once fled, he was also stepping into a framework that limits flexibility. Tradition, protocol, legal exposure. Expectations that don't bend easily. His move looked like grounding, but it also looked like confinement. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle was doing the opposite. By staying exactly where she wasn't standing still. She was anchoring, establishing continuity, making sure that if lines were drawn, they would be drawn on familiar terrain, under familiar rules. Ask yourself this. When one person changes countries and the other doesn't, who controls the definition of normal? That's the contradiction that changed how insiders interpreted everything. Harry's move felt emotionally honest. Meghan's move felt structurally decisive. One driven by introspection, the other by foresight. And then came the detail that made people uneasy. Those close to the situation noticed that advisors, not emotions, were now shaping the language around the couple. Words became careful, neutral, prepared. The tone shifted from personal to procedural. As if both sides understood that whatever came next wouldn't be handled in private conversations alone. That's usually the sign. The sign that a marriage is no longer being held together by hope, but managed by contingency. What's most striking is that neither side appears surprised. No frantic damage control. No desperate reunification narrative. Just quiet positioning. As if both Harry and Meghan know exactly what phase they're in, even if the public is still catching up. So here's the unsettling question you have to sit with. What if the separation wasn't caused by this decision, but revealed by it? What if the real break happened earlier, and this was simply the moment it became visible? Because when preparation replaces persuasion, the ending has already begun. And the next move in this story won't be emotional, symbolic, or performative. It will be formal. And once that step is taken, there's no headline, no interview, no explanation that can undo it. Because what comes next won't ask for understanding. It will demand acceptance. So where does this leave us, really? Not with a dramatic press conference. Not with a single explosive announcement that answers everything. But with something far more unsettling. A quiet ending that feels almost intentional. At the beginning of this story, the question was simple but jarring. How does a couple that once insisted they were inseparable end up choosing different continents? Now, after following the trail of decisions, silences, and strategic pauses, the answer feels heavier. Because this wasn't chaos. It was alignment. Just not with each other. Harry's return to the UK looks, on the surface, like a man going home. But beneath that surface, it reads like someone reclaiming an identity that had been suspended for years. A man circling back to unfinished emotional business, to family dynamics he never fully resolved, to a place that still defines him whether he likes it or not. That move isn't loud. It's reflective, almost resigned. Meghan's refusal to follow, on the other hand, tells a different story. One of certainty, of boundaries that don't bend, of a future imagined without compromise. Staying put isn't about fear of the past. It's about control over what comes next. Over narrative, over footing, over leverage. And here's the irony that makes this story sting. For years, the world debated who was leading who sacrificed more, who had the upper hand. But in the end, it may not be about power at all. It may be about timing. About two people reaching clarity at the same moment and realizing their clarity points in opposite directions. Ask yourself this. If this were just a rough patch, wouldn't we have seen urgency? Wouldn't there be visible effort to bridge the gap, to soften the optics, to keep the we intact just a little longer? Instead, what we're seeing is acceptance, careful movement, emotional restraint, the kind that usually comes after the hardest conversations have already happened. And that's the emotional payoff most people aren't ready for. This doesn't feel like a fight. It feels like a conclusion quietly being honored. The opening question asked whether this was the end or simply another chapter. After everything we've unpacked, the answer may be more uncomfortable than either option. This may be the moment where two people stop trying to rewrite each other and start rewriting themselves. But don't mistake calm for closure, because the next phase of this story won't unfold through whispers and body language. It won't live in speculation or symbolism. It will arrive through formal steps, legal language, and irreversible decisions that don't care about public nostalgia. So the real question now isn't whether it's over. It's how prepared each side is for what happens when it truly is. Because when one person goes home and the other stays behind without looking back, the ending doesn't announce itself. It simply locks into place.